We're excited to be here today, and Annie, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tatum, and thank you all for inviting me to host this session. I'm really glad to have a chance to speak with this audience and talk about a really timely subject today. I'm kind of seeing the chat go crazy already, and it's delightful. I just need to say out loud, I'm not very good at being a presenter and watching the chat at the same time. So will someone just verbally flag for me if there's something that I need to address in there? But also love the opportunity for folks to build community and be in community in the chat while we're here together. So my name is Annie Contractor. That's just my name. It's confusing. I usually have to say that at the beginning of everything I do. And I'm really glad to be here with Rural Assembly and Radically Rural. I run AB Contractor LLC. It's a consulting practice where I focus on the community side of policy development, helping communities understand what's happening in their backyards, name what they need, and get their voices into those policy decisions that shape their future. That work really is across a range of issues: data centers, renewable energy, childcare development, economic and community development. Those are all in the scope of what I do, helping bring in community voice into policy. And it shows up in this industry quite a bit. You might have heard the phrase license to operate, which is this idea that development it only really is successful long term when the community that surrounds it is genuinely bought in. And I'm here today because that framing applies directly to data centers, and rural communities deserve good tools to be able to engage with it. I want to set the tone right from the start. This presentation isn't for or against data centers. It's really about helping you all navigate information that can be genuinely confusing, so that you and your community have leverage to make decisions on your own terms and plan ahead rather than always being in reactive mode. And I've spent the last couple of months going deep on this issue specifically to be useful to practitioners and rural residents like the folks in this room. What I'm offering today is a translation of what we know, what's disputed, and what communities can actually do through a practitioner lens. So let's jump in. Oh, went too far. Before I say anything else, I want to know what you all are bringing to the room today. So I'm going to launch a quick Slido poll. And the question is, how close are you to the data center issue right now? 0 means you're not entirely sure what a data center is. And 5 means you've actively engaged already with a developer, a utility, or a local government. So here is the way to access that. The options are here on the screen. If you have a mobile phone, you can scan the QR code and that will bring you directly to the poll. Or if you'd like to do it on your computer, on your desktop, you can go to slido.com and put in that number for this particular poll, and then it should bring it right up and you can provide answers. And I'm seeing those come through. It's looking great. All right. Seeing the little sliders move around. I'm going to give it a few more seconds for folks to get in there and respond. I'm seeing a lot of folks have a data center proposed near you or you live near one. Second most common response so far, data centers are coming up in conversation. About a third and a third having those experiences. A few less actively involved. All right. Awesome. So this is a group of people who have some experience on this issue. That's going to help us shape the conversation. We do spend a little bit of time on sort of like defining the issue, but I'll kind of try to keep that short today and get into the what's disputed and our tools. All right. Keep on responding. Um, I think this will be really helpful for us as we go along. So, thank you all for sharing your experiences. I want to invite you to share your experience in the chat because it would be helpful for me to go back to that as an area that I'm working on and be able to review those experiences. And we do also have 15 to 20 minutes for more discussion later in the presentation. So, thank you all for your willingness to participate, and I hope we have a chance to come back to that in just a little bit. All right. So what I have for you today is kind of broken up into four sections. I want to go through some of the basics of what data centers are and why rural communities are sort of in the crosshairs for their development. I want to do a quick review of the political landscape because there is a lot happening right now, and a lot has changed in the last year or so. I want to spend a pretty good chunk of time on what's disputed because not everything we hear about data centers is settled fact. And then I want to close us out with what communities can do. Um, where I'd like to leave you with some practical tools. So let's start with the basics. With the vast use of technology in the United States, there are already over 5,400 data centers in place nationwide. And this is a map from the National Renewable Energy Lab, which has recently been renamed, and I forgot the name, but it's recently been renamed. But this is a map that was developed showing that interconnectivity of those. And that combines conventional data centers and AI data centers. So, data centers are warehouse scale facilities that house the servers that power cloud storage, streaming, AI, and frankly, most of the internet. It's not new, actually. What's new and what we're talking about primarily today is the scale that AI is demanding for these data centers. An AI data center is not the same as the data centers that came before. A conventional data center, the kind that runs like your Google Drive, your Netflix that you might stream in the evenings or host a website, one of those would power roughly the equivalent of 10,000 to 25,000 homes worth of electricity. Just to kind of put some scale to that, my hometown of Laramie, Wyoming has about 25,000 people. So that's roughly the size of community that could be powered by a traditional or conventional data center. An AI-focused hyperscale facility can use the equivalent of 100,000 homes or more of power, 3 to 10 times as much as those conventional ones. So, an example here, Meta's planned Hyperion data center in Louisiana is expected to draw more than twice the power of the city of New Orleans. So, what's creating that difference is the hardware. AI chips consume 2 to 4 times as many watts as traditional processors do, and they also generate far more heat. And that means there needs to be more cooling. And the cooling is where the water demand comes from. We're going to talk a lot about water demand today. Traditional data centers run at about 5 to 10 kilowatts per server rack, and those AI optimized facilities push that up roughly 10 times as much, about 60 to over 100 kilowatts per rack. So that can be in the same physical footprint, but just a degree higher level of demand. And sometimes water use can scale accordingly, although we're going to talk about some of the nuances around that today. Each 100-word AI prompt uses roughly a bottle of water for cooling. So multiply that by the billions of daily prompts happening worldwide right now. So much activity in the chat right now. If you're typing something in, just imagine each one of those comments you're putting in there taking, a half a bottle of water or a bottle of water. You're welcome for that visual. So this presentation isn't meant to be about anti-technology. It's about recognizing that the infrastructure serving AI is just really fundamentally a different scale and different from what communities have dealt with before, including the planning, permitting, and community agreements that need to reflect the differences. All right. So why rural? Why are rural places where we need to talk about this at a heightened level? Developers don't really end up in these rural places and next to small towns by accident. There are at least four concrete reasons we can identify why they would be attractive places for these kinds of data center developments. The first is that they're probably going to find the kind and quantity of land they need at a cheaper price in rural places. Hyperscale facilities need relatively flat space and sometimes hundreds of acres, and rural areas can deliver that at a price that's usually different than something near cities. The second reason is grid access. Rural electric co-ops and smaller utilities can often connect major new loads to the grid faster than congested urban systems. So there's less competition for the capacity, and the interconnection queue is often shorter at the local level, and that's attractive to these kinds of developers. The third reason that rural places might be attractive for these companies is that there are fewer barriers. Smaller local governments and less regulatory infrastructure, and also the fact that many local communities, rural local communities, have been told for decades that any industry is good industry. That kind of creates this environment that has fewer regulatory barriers. And, unfortunately, that's not necessarily a compliment to rural governance. And it is a description of what developers are often looking for, is fewer hoops to jump through. The fourth identifiable reason rural is attractive is that there can often be tax incentives at these local levels that are attractive for development. One of those is called tax increment financing, or TIF. And it works like this. When a development comes to a community, that developer or that company is likely to negotiate with the local government to try to get some kind of deal. And a TIF deal would freeze the local tax base at the current value. And the new tax revenue that comes after that the development would generate specifically, and there usually are negotiations around how to calculate how much of that revenue is coming from the new development. Typically, that tax revenue would flow back into public services like schools and roads and sewer infrastructure. But in these agreements, that gets rediverted back to the developer to reinvest in their organization or their company. This is something that has happened in local examples. Julia Tilton, who's a reporter for the Daily Yonder, has reported on this a bit. Wisconsin has recently removed caps on how much data center TIF deals can funnel, and they specifically named Oracle and OpenAI. That was just recent reporting from January, and shout out to Julia Tilton for that reporting. She found that the Wisconsin TIF structure is a direct financial incentive for the world's biggest companies to target small rural communities that may have less capacity on a governance level to protect themselves. There is resident pushback in those cases. Local people are raising the alarm about their tax base being basically handed over with very little input from the public. But I use this story to just say, the headline number about what an AI data center or any kind of data center might bring to a community is probably not the net number in terms of, economic value. And I would encourage the, 38% of you in the room who are facing these developments in your community to really look into what also is flowing in the other direction from the community to the developer or to the company that's coming in to get a realistic picture of what that economic value is going to look like. Here are some of the numbers coming out about data centers. First, data centers are projected to account for about 12% of all electricity used in the United States by 2028. That's just 2 years away. That's up from 4.4% today. And this is a projection from the Department of Energy. And because it's a projection, it's not a certainty. And I do want to caveat this because there is reporting from other parts of the world, other countries, where the projected energy demand has actually not panned out, which can be positive, but it can also be negative. We're going to talk about that a little more later with the infrastructure demands. But those projections are there. They're also disputed. A second number to kind of put on your radar is around water use. Folks are measuring water use at some of these developments, especially in other places like in the EU, where that's a mandate to measure it and to report it. And a large facility using traditional evaporative cooling can use up to about 5 million gallons per day. That's on the high end, and there is some precedent for closed loop systems. We also have an example I'm going to talk about a little later from Applied Digital, planning a development in Ellendale, North Dakota, and they're planning to use this closed loop system. And those systems use nearly zero water. It's a demonstrated innovation, it's in use in other places. And so there is really a big range of possible futures on both the energy demand front and the water demand front. And without transparency requirements, communities facing these developments aren't going to really know what the picture looks like for them. So that's one of those places where folks can ask for that transparency to understand what they're really facing. Okay, now let's talk about what's happening in policy. As I was kind of doing the background research on this, I wanted to tell you that it first started to feel to me just like this long list of things that have happened. But as I started to put together, I saw that there's a few different beats emerging that kind of give us a direction of travel for where policy is heading. So let me kind of walk through three big signals that I'm seeing. The first one is a federal signal. Some of you might have caught in the State of the Union address last week that President Trump announced he called for ratepayer protection. He announced a ratepayer protection pledge. He said he had negotiated with some of the big tech companies and to require them to provide for their own power needs, building their own generation capacity, and that was so that residential utility bills don't go up. It's worth naming because it's a large issue. It's gotten to this level of being on the president's, national address. When it shows up there, it's not a niche concern. But I just want to kind of name what that pledge is and isn't. Independent legal experts, one that I reviewed from the Harvard Electricity Law Initiative, that director said that, that pledge is unenforceable as the president announced it. The president can't unilaterally change how data centers pay for their energy because those terms are in utility contracts and those get regulated by state commissions and federal regulators. Any of the real changes have to go through those processes. And another thing that person pointed out is that several of the named companies had already made those commitments voluntarily before the State of the Union address. But we do see that federal signal is validating the concern that's pretty widespread, and it made its way into the State of the Union address. But that is not the way to solve it because the mechanisms that actually set rates are closer to home, which is an argument for local folks to be involved and to be engaging on these topics. The second signal that I want to call out here is that several states are proving that durable protection requires legislation, not pledges, and that the industry can adapt when it's required to do so. And Stacy, your example of your state not taking advantage of that is a little heartbreaking, but we do have some examples of states that are being really proactive about this. Texas has Senate Bill number 6, which was signed last year in June, and that's a pretty clear example. That one stipulates that data centers at 75 megawatts or more pay their own grid connection and transmission costs. They have a provision that $100,000 has to be paid for upfront screening fees, and there's a mandatory curtailment during grid emergencies. They also have a provision in there for full disclosure of behind the meter generation. And the industry has adapted to meet that need. And that's in Texas, a place that, traditionally is very industry forward. The chief operating officer of the Electric Reliability Council of Texas basically said it this way. He said, we can change, we can adapt. So basically, when folks put pressure and there's teeth behind it, there is an opportunity for folks to say, how this can be, the risk can be shared. Also, Georgia, South Carolina, Ohio, and Nevada are all moving in similar directions with having some of those requirements for these kinds of developments. A few other state actions to mention: Wisconsin, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Oregon all have transparency and disclosure bills in motion. The Georgia Public Service Commission approved nearly 10 gigawatts of new capacity in December of last year. But in that case, ratepayers right now are still bearing the bulk of the risk, especially if demand falls short. That is something that has happened in other countries where the anticipated demand just really didn't come through. So it's a concern worth mitigating. If there is a huge investment to build this generating capacity, having some measures in place so that especially residential ratepayers are not the ones who have to pay for that additional generation, so that that risk isn't just sitting on the residential ratepayers. And the pattern here is that I want to kind of call out is that when states do choose to use state level legislation and when communities push for it, which is something we have a lot of power to do, those kinds of legislation can be really impactful and effective with these data centers. All right, the third political piece I want to mention is that we are also seeing counter pressure to some of these state and local measures to try to make sure that companies that are benefiting from AI and pushing for this power generation, holding them accountable and mitigating the risk. There are folks trying to just push things through. As you probably know, the Trump administration has signed two separate executive orders, one in December of last year to preempt state and local authority, and then one a little farther back in July of last year to streamline federal permitting on data centers. So far, neither of these have been fully enforceable, but it's pretty clear that there is a sort of a narrative pressure for speed and scale as priorities over community voice. So there does need to be pushback in order to kind of balance that counter pressure. There also, I'm sure you all are familiar with a lot of these local tactics like moratoria and updating zoning in response. We're going to talk a little bit more about those tools later. And some of the need for that is coming out in the reporting. Mary, you mentioned the non-disclosure agreements. Wisconsin Watch reported on 4 separate communities that had signed secrecy agreements with developers before residents knew what was happening. And so proactive stance and proactive actions folks can take can be to try to push on those transparency requirements. So, I mean, the political landscape is telling us that there is a window open right now for local action, and it also tells us that there are folks trying to close that window and that there is some level of urgency to capture the opportunities available on the table right now. All right. I'm going to move to the next section now and talk a little bit about what is disputed. Not everything about data centers is settled science. Sometimes folks present it as if it is, and often those folks have an agenda. So just to say either one way or another, often if it's presented as settled, it might not have all the nuance in it. Before we get into the specifics, though, I do want to plant 2 ideas. First, keep in mind who we're talking about. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta, they spent around $240 billion on AI infrastructure in 2024 alone. Last year, that estimate was up to over $300 billion. And then with the commitments for 2026, that combined total is over $650 billion. These are among the most powerful corporations in history. The second thread that I want to pull out for everyone as we go through this conversation today is that the industry playbook on disputed facts is pretty consistent across water, energy costs, jobs, and physical impacts. Communities keep having to hold more risk than they're told up front. So I just wanted to flag that for you all to notice that pattern over the next section. All right. I have another opportunity for you all to tell me what you know so that I know who I'm talking to. I have a question. Which of these claims about data centers have you heard in your community? I'm going to go ahead and flip to the next slide. Same protocol as before. There's a QR code here. If you want to do it on your desktop, go to slido.com, put in that code number, and then you can respond to these. Which of these have you heard of? A lot of folks are hearing about water and the potential to see raised electric rates or electric bills. You all are an informed group. 70% of you are saying that you've heard about them being loud or having landscape impacts. Some of the more positive possibilities about bringing jobs and revenue and clean energy, I'm noticing a pretty clear pattern here that those more positive potential impacts are getting a lot less visibility. So that's an interesting thing for us all to pay attention to. And also, you all know about AI data centers. Not many of you are saying that you haven't heard much. Okay, that's all very helpful. Um, let's look at the evidence because the reality is, as usual, more complicated than what we usually hear. And let's start with water use. This one is genuinely disputed, and both sides of the debate really have evidence. From the developer side, there's a lot of attention and push to point out that there are these closed loop and direct to chip systems that can cut water consumption up to 95%. And that example I mentioned before, and we're going to talk about it in more depth in a bit, Applied Digital in Ellendale, North Dakota. They're planning to use one of those closed loop systems that is projected to use less water than a single household. Again, I'm looking forward to getting into that example and talking a bit more about that possibility with you all. Another example to mention on the developer side, Microsoft committed in August of 2024 to zero water cooling designs for all of their new builds from that point forward. On the flip side, communities are seeing that fewer than a third of operators publicly track their water consumption in the United States, in contrast to, in the European Union, where tracking and reporting that is compulsory. And there was a Bloomberg report that found that two-thirds of new US data centers since 2022 are sited in water-stressed areas. Those don't have to be, in conflict. If we have these closed loop systems, then maybe they are compatible in water-stressed places, but we probably need the transparency to know that the right designs are going to the right places. And we do have this good data that a large facility using traditional evaporative cooling can use up to 5 million gallons a day, which I reported before. So, the technology exists to build facilities that use little or no water. The open questions are, will we know if a design is going to use one of those systems, and who's going to be checking to make sure that that's what's actually happening once it's operational? That's the risk that communities end up holding when we don't have visibility, we don't have transparency, or we don't have contracts that specify some of those provisions. All right, let's talk about costs, and especially since that was the second most common thing that you all have heard about as well. I'm glad I had this second in my deck. The industry data says centers pay their own way. Of course, that's one of their talking points that they want to drive home. They say they are not to blame for rate increases and rising prices. And they say that actually large customers have downward pressure on rates. So that's what they would like to point out and like everybody to hear. There are studies coming out. I reviewed a few peer-reviewed articles about this, as well as some other resources, and some independent analyses show that there really is increased rate pressure right now. Virginia's nonpartisan legislative auditor, JLARC, had a projection that they published that utility bill increases will increase $14 to $37 per month for Virginia residents by 2040. Another report from the Union of Concerned Scientists found $4.3 billion in grid costs being shifted to consumers across 7 states. And of course, this Georgia example I've mentioned a few times, where they're building new generation capacity, and the ratepayers are really bearing the risk of that at this point if the demand doesn't come through. I'm not trying to say that data centers are inherently bad for energy systems, but right now, the current structure allows that cost to be shifted from the wealthiest companies to residential taxpayers. And that's a policy choice. It's not an inevitability. And at least that Texas piece of legislation I mentioned earlier shows that it's a changeable policy decision. There are ways to do it differently. Uh, another point for you all to interact with me a little bit before today. How many of you were aware that data center energy costs could be shifted to residential taxpayers? I'm seeing folks bring this in. It seems like some of you maybe had heard something about energy costs, but maybe didn't know that the specifics of how that cost could be shifted. A lot of you knew this. A lot of you are concerned about that cost increase. Thank you all for engaging with me. It's nice to have some visual feedback that you all are here with me while I'm talking. It's really nice. All right. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, about 2/3 of you all knew about this cost shifting, and the majority of the rest of you thought that was probably something going on there, even if you didn't know the specifics. All right, let's shift and talk a little bit about the jobs claims. This is one of the things that can be most attractive to rural places that often are looking for some kind of industry investment or industry growth to support their populations. The industry does have real numbers in terms of economic benefit for the places where they create their developments. There in Virginia, we have a little bit of data that shows there are 74,000 jobs in the sector, and there is a $9.1 billion bump to GDP there. So there's potential for substantial tax revenue to benefit local places. On the flip side, a typical 250,000 square foot facility, once the construction's done, typically employs around 50 people in a permanent capacity. And a lot of that economic activity is really concentrated in the 12 to 18 months, a year or to year and a half of the construction phase. And even in Virginia, where there is this potential for a $9.1 billion bump to GDP, they have the largest tax exemption in the country at $928 million of a sales tax exemption for the industry. So the promise is substantial. The permanent benefit is smaller than often advertised, and often communities absorb infrastructure costs, especially after the construction phase is done. But there are some tools to put into play around these sorts of trade-offs. There's community benefits agreements of various types. You can work together, especially in negotiation, work with your local government to ask for enforceable hiring targets, for clawback provisions, and those can help close that gap. Some of these precedents are not brand new. They've been in place for a while. Detroit was one of the first communities to enact a community benefits ordinance way back in 2016. And then some of you may remember from the Biden administration, the Department of Energy had community benefits plans and created this model where folks, especially developers and companies getting any kind of federal support or subsidy, had to demonstrate how they were partnering with a local community to make sure that everyone was benefiting mutually. And those create pretty strong precedents for how this could be done. And I guess my question is, why shouldn't data center developers face some of these same kinds of requirements in order to get off the ground when they have so much to gain themselves? If any of you have been involved in a community benefit agreement, I would be really interested to talk about that in the discussion section. So please tee that experience up in your mind. Feel free also to drop something in the chat if you think there's something interesting to share about that experience on the positive or the negative side. I'd be very interested to talk about that more. All right, physical impacts. This is probably something that you all have heard quite a bit about. First of all, these are real structures in real life. The picture on the screen right now is of the Great Oak subdivision in Manassas, Virginia. And this is a community that knows a lot of this firsthand. Amazon built 4 data centers next to that neighborhood. And that development had 424 air exhaust vents on the roofs. Residents reported vibrations in their beds, children being moved to basements, housing foundations being cracked from the blasting from the development. But I wanted to share an example on the opposite side of that spectrum. A Cloud HQ development found that they got some feedback. They reversed their building orientation to direct noise toward an airport instead of toward residences. And they have had zero noise complaints. So there are design choices that can mitigate a lot of the complaints folks hear about. And those negative impacts don't have to be inevitabilities. Um, I wanted to flag the something to watch for is manufactured opposition because this is a really built out playbook. There was a 2024 National Academies of Sciences study that found fossil fuel companies funded astroturf organizations to block wind and solar. Many of the same complaints around these noise, view shed, and physical impacts are nearly identical between those complaints that came out of those astroturf organizations, even if they're not necessarily intending to target AI developments and data centers. Some of those complaints can have like spillover effects from people who may not even live in a community, but those talking points can gain traction and kind of jump from issue to issue. So I just wanted to flag that as something to watch for and just encourage everyone to look very carefully and verify sources because all of those impacts could be real. Also, they are impacts that could be mitigated, they can be measured, and they can be negotiated if communities are able to get into conversations with those potential developments early enough. And those can be some things that can be a condition of approval of a development. Before we talk about what communities can do, I want to just address really directly. Most people concerned about data centers are still using services that fill those data centers. And I will be the first to raise my hand and say that I'm one of them. It's not just AI, streaming videos, cloud storage of all your files, using social media, online shopping, something that's very important in rural communities, telemedicine. Those things all demand these data centers be present. And data centers were growing long before generative AI. Netflix alone accounted for over 15% of global internet traffic in 2023. So it was huge. And I'll just raise my hand again first and say, I used an AI tool earlier this morning in the process of getting ready to tell you about the problems with AI. So I want to invite you all to type a 1 in the chat if you used a streaming service, a cloud service, or an AI tool in the last 24 hours. I want to take a pause and just see if that's something that you all can relate to that experience. I'm seeing a lot. Good point. Someone said, isn't this one? That's exactly right. Yeah. Yes. Thank you all for your honesty and for joining me in that space. I don't think this is hypocritical. I think what it points to is that we're all stakeholders here, right? We all want access to good technology that benefits our lives, and we want that to not be at the expense of the communities that we live in and care about. So thanks for doing that with me. We're all in this tension together. All right. I want to tell you about Ellendale. I've referenced this community a couple of times already. And I also want to shout out Megan Langley from Strengthen, North Dakota, who shared this experience directly with me, and really wanted to highlight a positive experience with an AI development, because I think that it's really important to share the complexity of and the range of possible experiences that different communities can have with this kind of development. So Ellendale is a community of about 1,100 people. And there is a company called Applied Digital that showed up and bought land. They didn't ask first. They didn't hold a community meeting. They bought the land like a lot of companies do. And the folks in Ellendale found out about it the way communities often find out after the fact. And Megan shared that that really did create friction. And, I think you all can probably relate to that, how that might have gone down. But the folks in Ellendale knew what they needed. They had a grocery store that was about to close. They had no licensed childcare. That meant, families were facing really difficult choices, different difficult situations. The community needed housing. And they weren't dealing with abstract ideas. They were dealing with things that they knew they needed right now. Um, so when Applied Digital came back to the table, the folks in Ellendale had an opportunity to name things directly about what they needed out of a potential industrial development. And Applied Digital responded. A company executive personally purchased the grocery store to keep it open. A new daycare for 60 children opened in a renovated building. And the folks at Applied Digital were able to use some of their status as a business to bring in about $60,000 in planning support from the state of North Dakota to help that community really understand and plan for what they wanted and needed. New housing came through that negotiation through a Bank of North Dakota pilot program as well. None of that was in the original deal, in the original plan when Applied Digital bought the land. Um, this is the same community that I mentioned earlier, but they're meeting the community where they are, helping them meet what they need, but also trying to bring some of those innovations that we talked about before. This is the development I mentioned that uses less than the water needed for a single household through one of the closed loop cooling systems. So we know that the technology and the community relationship can both be done right. I just wanted to put that example on the table so that as we think through what's facing rural communities and how folks can respond, it's fighting a data center may be right for your community, but it's not the only option on the table. And community self-determination matters more than any single data center decision. All right. I want to talk a little bit about tools that we have available to us. We've just spent the last 30 minutes or so on disputed facts and real impacts. But here's what I kind of want to drive home. The companies driving this expansion, the ones spending $650 billion over the last, 2 to 3 years, they have more economic power than most state governments. And the question isn't really whether the technology is good or bad, it's whether communities get to be at the table when decisions are getting made about their water, their electricity, their landscape, their future. As I mentioned earlier, we have seen some of those secrecy deals happening, some of those non-disclosure agreements that Mary mentioned. And again, we're seeing that political environment where speed is being put as a higher priority than community voice. And that's the opportunity to push back. So some of the tools that are available can complement some of the innovations that are also being experimented with in the field. One of those innovations I want to mention is waste heat recovery. That's a really sharp example of a proactive negotiation that communities could embrace. There's an example, a couple of examples in motion or in operation already in Sweden and Quebec. I know Reimagine Appalachia recently published a report called Catching Heat that details some of these examples and also outlines the potential for using one of these designs in development in Ohio. So I just wanted to point out that there are ways to shift the conversation from one of being in a defensive stance to being in a proactive and maybe even a collaborative stance for something that could really be cool and innovative in local communities. All right. I have a handful of tools to talk through with you, and I've kind of organized them in my brain into three groups based on sort of the stage of development that you and your community might be as it relates to a data center development. The first stage is before a proposal arrives. You think you might be in a place that's attractive to a developer, and you and your community might want to try to think proactively about it. The second stage is when a proposal arrives or there's, an announcement about something that's coming. And then the third stage is a little closer when, deals are kind of finalized, but or not quite finalized, but we're getting closer to construction. There's an opportunity to shape what gets built. So let me kind of break that down a little bit. First, zoning and permitting. Defining data centers as an industrial use before anyone knocks is a really proactive step that communities can take to set clear standards around the noise, the setbacks, water usage, and stormwater. And because this is new enough, many communities haven't done it yet. But renewable energy developments have been, communities have been doing this to prepare for renewable energy developments as well. And so there is a lot of precedent in place for how to go about that, and what kinds of provisions folks might want to consider as they think about defining some of those zoned and permitting uses. Planning and zoning meetings are exactly as interesting as they sound. So if you're going to take this strategy, bring some coffee, bring a friend, but they also are maybe one of the most impactful places where an individual can show up and have an impact. So if you are in a community that's in early stage or maybe hasn't yet been approached by a developer, this is a place where I think interaction could be really impactful. And that relates to the preemptive planning as well. This is really on the community needs side, where folks can start getting together and working with their local elected officials to define what their community needs so that they're kind of ready for a negotiation with a developer that might want to come in and say, we need something from this community. And they could say, great, we need something from you too. And having those asks ready in hand, and especially pre-negotiated, can really shift the power balance between communities and the developers that are approaching them. This pre-proposal stage is also the most effective time for a moratorium to be in place. We know that that's one of the targets of those executive orders from the Trump administration, is that they're trying to make it where you can't put up in place a moratorium. But as I said before, a lot of those actually haven't been enforceable fully. So I still think it's a useful tool in the toolbox. And what those moratoria do is really give you time. Often they're 6 or 12 months long. Often there might be a task force developed to study, think about what other communities have used for some of those zoning and permitting definitions, and then decide how that community wants to engage or not engage with AI data center development. So that's a really valuable policy tool you can use. And this also could kind of straddle into that proposal stage. And a second tool in that proposal stage is working on transparency requirements. This can also be coupled with public records requests. So requiring disclosure of water use, energy load, noise modeling data, and any tax incentives that are being negotiated are a couple of the specific things that can be asked for in both public records requests and in any negotiated transparency requirements. Um, Julia shared with me that through her reporting, she found that folks in Wisconsin were using some of those public records request tools as individual citizens to expose those elected officials who had been in private discussions. So this is something I just want to highlight that's not only available to people who might do this for a profession, like a journalist, but anyone can file a public records request. And if that, some organizations offer trainings on how to do that. And so if that's something that you think your community could use, I think that would be, really useful to share, and perhaps we could help you get connected to a resource. Once we're kind of closer to the build out of a data center, there's a couple of additional tools that are maybe more useful, focusing on those innovations, like the heat recovery. That is something that would be one that you might want to talk about and negotiate with the developer when they're in that design phase, and to say, how can we make this a mutually beneficial design, a beneficial development for everyone. A second one is to be thinking about that rate class separation, and making sure that if a development is moving forward, that the developer is kind of actually paying its own way, and that there are provisions in place to protect the residential ratepayers as that development gets underway. I'm kind of curious where folks are with what you want to do next. That would really give me a really good pulse check about where support could be helpful. So let's get that poll up on the screen. I have a couple of options here. And let me know if there's something that's jumping to you that you want to engage with after this conversation today. I see a few of you ready to talk to zoning officials already. That's awesome. A lot of you are ready to share community information with your communities, your neighbors. Some of you want to do some more research. This is awesome. Yeah, I love it. About half of you are ready to share information. That's amazing. Maybe something we can kind of share with the zeitgeist is the need for some of those communication resources that might help you all in the future. Awesome. All right. And this is the last one before we wrap up. Thinking sort of how you engage with organizations like Rural Assembly, like Radically Rural, or even other organizations that might be more local. I'm just trying to think about sort of that relationship between individuals and the community of advocacy organizations that want to support people. What could organizations do to help you right now? And this is going to come up as a word cloud, so I'm really excited to see what open-ended answers tell us. More education needed. Need some action steps. Need a toolbox and research. Folks want to be brought together. More community input. Yeah. I see someone saying, no need to rush. They need locals more than we need them. I think that is interesting to think about, like, hold your power. That's really interesting. But yeah, education is like loud and clear here.
Annie, I want to lift up a couple in the chat, pro bono legal help and
Yeah.
advocacy support.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a few that what you didn't see on my slide deck as you're putting in some more words, please continue. I have a few appendix slides with resources. I have a few additional resources to share out or to add to it before I share out the slides with you today. But I just want to let you know that there is an appendix with lots of clickable links coming your way. Awesome. I wish I knew more pro bono legal resources, but I will keep adding to my list as I get them. All right. Okay, loud and clear, more education, unbiased education. I see that. Webinars. and community. So thank you all for letting us know what you need. I think that's really helpful and guiding for me. As we're closing this out, I just want to thank you all for spending time with us today. I know Tainum remembered to hit the record button, so we're recording, and I think that's going to be shared with registrants. As I mentioned, the slide deck will be shared. If you'd like to be in touch with me, I would welcome it. My email is on the screen. I'm also going to pop it in the chat so you
I
can
got you,
copy it.
Annie.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah. Um, and if you want to talk more about what your community is facing, I'm reachable there. And just one more thank you and shout out to Megan Langley for sharing that Ellendale story, which was a really nice textured example for me to dig into as I did some more background research on this, and especially found some positive stories to ground us in. So thank you to Tainum and the Radically Rural team as well. I just really appreciated the opportunity to be here with you all today.
Thanks, Annie. And thank you, everybody, for such an active discussion in the chat and out loud, all of your questions. As we know, this is an actively developing issue, and we wanted to provide a space to cover some basics. Obviously, there's much more to cover, and we encourage the connections that you all have been making in the chat today, and just really want to thank you for the work that you do both on this issue, but otherwise in your rural communities across the country. I don't think there's a soul here who's not doing a lot locally across the board. So thank you. We are always here at Rural Assembly as a connection point and gathering space for rural issues. Same with our colleagues at Radically Rural. Thanks to Juliana and Lillian. Thanks again to Annie for such a fantastic presentation. So much information shared. I wish we had several more hours to continue going deep. And I saw many comments in the chat hoping to get networked with each other and look for additional resources. So we'll review those, see if there's anything that we can do. But once again, thank you for being with us today. I really appreciate you all and don't hesitate to be in touch. Thanks again.